So welcome to this exploration in large system complex change. Today we're pleased to look at South African Food Lab. I've been a follower of some of this work over the years, and we're very pleased to have with us today Milla McLachlan and Scott Drimie, who are intimately involved in the food lab. Scott, you had many different titles when I looked at your bio. Do you want us to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thanks very much, Stephen. It's very nice to be sharing this experience. Primarily, I'm a consultant working with a number of organizations around questions of food and nutrition, and I deal a great deal with institutional questions, the arrangements for implementing, putting into effect policy, for example, programming, trying to deal with some interesting arrangements for how things can best be done in terms of this question around food and food security. But a big part of my life is around the Southern African Food Lab, and I'm currently the director of the lab. And I took on that mantle from Milla. And so I think it works very well that the two of us are able to talk about the last 6 years, and that both of us have been at the helm over that period. So Milla, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Where shall I start?
Yeah.
I always start by saying I seem to spend my whole life in food. But yeah, I'm currently a consultant. I live in Portland in Oregon and moved back from South Africa 2 years ago now almost. And I have done work in food and nutrition in different roles for many, many years. I can start talking now about some of the history of the lab, if that's okay, unless, Steve, you want to say a few words about your own work and how it connects.
Please go ahead, Milla. Let's launch into the lab.
Okay, to talk a little bit about life before the lab, I was at the World Bank and really looking for. I was working at the World Bank in Washington D.C. and I was increasingly frustrated with how we were tackling what I consider to be really tough issues like nutrition and food security, and went in search of places where innovation was happening, and was fortunate to connect with people in the Sustainable Food Lab and in what was then Generon Consulting, and that later became Rios Partners. So I was very taken with the approach that they were using, learned about the U process and Otto Sharmer's work and so on. And then I did a master's degree in transpersonal psychology with an emphasis on eco-psychology at Naropa. And as part of my thesis work, I wrote a paper on the Sustainable Food Lab and how one might approach something like that in South Africa. So I had this dream of doing something like the Sustainable Food Lab, but in South Africa. And then when I went to South Africa, I went back to South Africa after living in the States for many years. I was fortunate to be asked by the Southern Africa Development Bank to do some work on food security and to bring together researchers who've been working in food security. So I did that, and we did the normal academic thing of writing papers. But in the process, I was encouraged to meet with Ralph Hamann, who was at the time and still is at the business school at the University of Cape Town, and he was doing work on food security, but from a business perspective, and whereas my work was more looking at policy issues and so on. And we were having tea up at the Rhodes Memorial on Table Mountain, and we just both sort of realized that we both had this understanding of the Change Lab approach, the U process, and we both had the sense that something needed to be done in the food system. And so that started a conversation that eventually led to a meeting in Johannesburg, in which we gathered about 70 people, and this process started. Ralph knew people in Rios Partners, and so they became a partner in this work from the very beginning, Colleen Magner, and they are still involved in the lab. So that's how we got started.
Just to explain a little bit about the Rios Partners connection there. There is Adam. Oh, we've got Luzma. Is that Luz Maria?
Oh, just a minute. Yes, I'm just trying to set up. I had a hard time connecting.
Okay.
So just a minute.
Well, welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. I was not ready. So can you please ignore me for a while?
Okay, I will mute you.
Okay. Thanks.
So Ralph knew Rios Partners, and just to explain, Rios Partners includes Adam Kahane, who lives part-time in South Africa, who is associated with very closely with Otto Sharmer, Peter Senge, and that whole group.
And was really active in the creation of the Sustainable Food Lab. And I met Adam while I was at the bank, and so that was really where it started. So I had a Rios connection as well, but it wasn't as strong and personal as well. But.
And what year was this then?
That was must have been in 2005.
Okay.
4 or 5, because I came back to South Africa in 2006.
Okay,
yeah.
So continue with the story then. We're sitting here on the agenda.
Well, obviously it took a while because we needed to raise money for the lab. After the Gibbs meeting, we were able to raise funds from what was then GTZ, now GIZ, and for a year-long U process for a complete change lab process, as it was called then. It's now, the language has changed a little bit now. But anyway, so we did the reflection part at the beginning. We interviewed, we had dialogue interviews with people from different components of the food system in South Africa.
Just to pause on the U process, so there's 3 crucial steps in the U process. One is doing the collective analysis.
Sensing.
Co-sensing, and then the presencing, getting to a space where people can imagine the future beyond what they might have traditionally been able to do. And then the third step is in co-creating the activities that fall out of the reimagining. So you did the co-sensing through creating the interest in the lab and interviewing people then, is that right?
Yeah, and then we wrote a background paper based on those interviews and some of the academic work we had done before. And then we also organized a number of learning journeys. And I always think that learning journeys are really not field trips. They are much more than that, because they actually, it's all about seeing oneself in the system and seeing the system in a different way. So it often took us to parts of the system where we don't normally work. And a large part of it is then engaging with people in the vegetable markets, the street markets in Johannesburg, and understanding the system from their perspective, or beginning, getting a glimpse of that, and then coming back and reflecting as a group together on that. And so it really opens us to see the diversity of perspectives in the system, and to begin also to challenge our own definition of the problem, and what might be possible approaches to solving it. So out of that, we then reconvened in a workshop that would sort of, in the U process terms, would be at the presencing stage, and in which we reflected on all of the findings, as it were, and then the groups were asked to identify particular issues in the food system that they had energy to address. And so there were a number of issues that came up, and the one, to sort of cut the very long story short, the one area that really seemed to resonate and still has legs in the system was the whole issue of the integration of smallholder farmers into the food system.
So just to welcome Hetty Walter, who's joined us. Welcome, Hetty.
Hello. Good afternoon to all of you.
Just introduce yourself to Milla and Scott.
Yeah, I'm Hetty Walters. I work for Fair and Sustainable Advisory Services, mainly working on multi-stakeholder processes, systemic change, and I'll be contributing to the discussion on large systems change from that angle.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Hetty.
Thank you.
So just to go back a little bit, Milla, when you said you went through the U process and you started with the co-sensing, was there, what sort of things did you come up with that were particularly outstanding for you? Was there anything that you can remember? I know that's a few years ago.
It's a long time ago.
But when you think maybe in comparison to the other Sustainable Food Lab that inspired your Sustainable Food Lab, maybe there would be some distinctive differences.
Well, of course, the Sustainable Food Lab had a very strong emphasis on the environmental, on making sustainable production mainstream, so about bringing more sustainable production methods and processing methods into the mainstream. And whereas I think our lab started from a very distinct focus on food security in terms of hunger and malnutrition. And in a sense, a lesser emphasis on. So I would say, in South Africa, it was very much around how do we create a viable food system in a country with huge huge differences, a dualistic agriculture system, nutrition system that has both overnutrition and undernutrition coexisting in the society, a large industrial agriculture system, and a very a smallholder farming system that is involves many people but is very underdeveloped and has been marginalized in the system. And then, of course, there was an understanding that there are environmental challenges, and that we need to think about all of this within that context. But we've always had to think about
food security first.
I think the food security in any case was the kind of the issue around which we organized at the beginning. And I think the work that we had been doing from this policy space was really looking at food security from a household and individual perspective, how do people access food, there are links between food security and poverty and that kind of thing. Whereas the work that Ralph was doing that was dealing with how the business world perceived food security, there was the added dimension of long-term availability of food and the trade situations, but also the role of the retail sector in addressing poverty and food security. And
Okay, that's great. That gives us a real good context. When you referred to the presencing, what did that look like? What did you actually do? Who was there?
Well, we always say that the challenge for us was that the U was really ended up being more. Whew, there's a very bad background noise.
I've just muted.
That the U was, and it seems like it's dropped out. Not Steve, Scott. That the U tended to be more of a V than a U, and that the spending that deep reflection time has always been shortchanged in our efforts, and so it's been a real topic of conversation among in the steering group and the facilitation group, that how do we deepen that point of reflection. But we did that in the by including activities like going on dialogue walks and having people do individual journaling and things like that, to really ask the question, well, if this is the situation, what does it mean for me? What comes up for me in terms of my own energy, my organization's capacity to start doing something about this? That makes sense? You're muted.
I'm sorry. It's absolutely makes sense. So you came out of this process, and you then went into the creation process, and you were just telling us what you decided to really focus on.
Yeah, there were I think 5 groups that formed out of that, and I would say that of those groups, really the ones that had legs and remained remained active was the ones looking at the issue of smallholders and smallholder integration. And looking back on that, I think for us that has really been, it is such a central issue in the South African food system that was appropriate. And we then went through a phase of having virtually no funding, and just had a few meetings over that first year after the completion of the first U. And would have to say that what kept it going was the passion of the group, that this really was valuable, even though we were struggling with funding, and but we kept going. And then we after that we had engagement with the Ford Foundation, and they suggested that we put together a proposal jointly between ourselves, the lab, and PLAS, which is a center for research on agriculture and food systems at the University of the Western Cape. People that we've had some engagement with over time, but hadn't worked closely together. So we did that, and we got the funding, and so we were then able to embark on a process that had sort of 2 legs. There was an academic research component on value chains, and there was a dialogue process that we were responsible for, that would take these issues around smallholder farmers and set up a dialogue process around that. So we embarked on that, and that is still ongoing, right, Scott? So we, in a sense, redid the U, did a second round of the U, by again looking at the system, going on extensive number of learning journeys to different parts of the country, engaging with smallholder farmers, having consultations with the farmers. The farmers, groups of farmers also came to the urban area on learning journeys, in which they had really the first exposure for many of them to what happens to the food when it leaves the farm gate. And I think that process also really broadened the participation in the lab in this part of the lab to include representatives from the farmers. And that's been a really interesting process for me. Sorry, Steve.
Just to help us a little bit with the time here, then.
Yeah.
Was it 2010 about that you started the actual, the second process of going through the U?
It started really in 2011, and really the learning journeys were only in 2012.
Okay.
Yeah, that process, the really active process, was in 2012, 2013.
So just to point out that I think many people think of the U as a process that you've just done and you don't do again, but I found that people do have to bring back and revisit and repeat it. Eh?
Yeah, and I think, in fact, it's I sort of see it as a sort of a cyclical thing, but it goes upwards, as it were. In this case, we focus then on one particular issue, but even then, when you form groups that look at a particular issue, they themselves need to sort of make sure that their problem definition is deep and thoughtful, and they need to continue to reflect on their own roles and how they show up in the process. And then I think how we do the prototyping and the testing of initiatives, and maybe Scott can talk a little bit about that. Because this group has become quite action oriented, so they are now doing things with farmers to influence the system. So it is not a one-off kind of thing. It's a moving process. But I think I'd like to have Scott take the story further, because by that time I was about stepping out of the lab.
Great, Scott. Over to you.
I had the privilege of engaging with Milla right from the outset in that development bank research process. And I and a close colleague, James Garrett, were busy with a paper to try and understand the challenges of the implementation of policy in South Africa and why so many of the food security had fallen flat. And in our paper, we looked at the U and the potential power of it. And then Milla and Ralph came together, and they created the space where suddenly there was this real opportunity to engage with it, with government. And I think that was what the allure for me was at the beginning. And so very happily was brought in to work with Milla over a few years. And then as Milla began to pull away slightly as she was returning to the US, I was pulled in more centrally to work at the helm. I made it very clear that we needed to be continually working as a collective, and that there was without that, we had a real threat of falling short because of resource constraints, but also because of how we were learning together about how to do this about the convening and about the dialogue. And Milla's pointed out a few things that we've learned, and that is this continual through the process. We're very good at bringing the co-sensing, particularly when we work with research organizations, that we're able to align research, new thinking, new ideas, and then bringing different actors together with their own views, and to then immerse and go we haven't been, I believe, successful in terms of really presencing. And so we've had to go then back to the co-sensing again, and this repetition has become very important.
How have people reacted to that idea of the presencing then? Is there resistance amongst people for doing it, or why would you say you're not successful at it, as successful?
So when, for example, in the smallholder work, we had been on a number of learning journeys throughout different parts of the country, looking at a great deal of issues with a number of farmers walking alongside us. And we came then to this lab where we would begin to co-create what we hoped would be innovation. There was this real frustration amongst a lot of participants to get going with something. They wanted activities, and in many ways became frustrated with the presencing. They wanted to get on to active projects. And it was a lot about who was really speaking and leading at that stage. And it was a lot of NGOs and a lot of activists, in fact. And so it's the importance of bringing those groups together with others and to really investing in going deeper and taking it is self-motivating and motivating opportunity. And so it's a lot about time and a lot about the anxiety of what we are doing and wanting to get to action. So I think that's been a challenge.
Do you think
in
of
the
it now as
small,
you've been successful in getting them to experience the presencing, or do you think that that's an ongoing question?
It's certainly an ongoing question, but I can say that the steering group, the group that has stayed with the lab right from the inception, as we went on our last U process, which was about a month ago, in a retreat for the steering group and for other leaders in the process, for me it really came out as people began to trust this. And so I think those that have really stayed the line and walked along with the lab for a very long period of time, it becomes much easier, and people can then learn to trust it. But for
Can
people,
I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Who are the people or the organizations that are still with you from the inception phase onwards? Because PLAS, as I understood it well, came in later, but are they also still with you in the new use?
So, I mean, again, I think that's a great question. It is less about the organizations and more about the individuals that have walked alongside. So, for example, someone from the Worldwide Trust for Nature, Tatjana van Borman, right from the beginning has been really engaged. And she has been increasingly using the U and presencing in her own work outside of the lab. There have been people like Ralph Haman. There have been people like many of the Rios facilitators who have both been enablers, but also participants as they themselves, and others. PLAS were very engaged in a particular component of our work around the smallholder work, and they were very committed. But as the innovations began to emerge and as different groups began to take some of these ideas beyond, they felt that their work was done as researchers, and they retreated back to the university to continue researching and engaging. But they've continued to feed in terms of new ideas and helping us reflect on some of the arguments that were raised earlier. But just the point is, it's so much these individuals that spark, and if that individual leads, often that organization doesn't necessarily continue. It is a challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
So the inclusion of smallholders, as Milla pointed out, has been incredibly important in terms of that presencing, and that we have people that are often very well resourced, who are wanting to get moving with things, but the inclusion and the engagement with smallholders have enabled a much clearer idea about what's possible. And as so-called innovation have emerged, and we look at innovation as being a new idea with new partnerships or relationships, with new commitment to really drive something that might lead to a change. As those have started with smallholders, we've had to recognize the reality of how smallholders truly are excluded from the mainstream, and that it takes a large amount of time and effort and working alongside those smallholders, all these things to emerge, if we are to stop repeating the old patterns of having elites solving the problems, but rather allowing the problems to percolate upwards from where they matter. And that's one reason why the lab has been fully engaged with the series of smallholder projects, even beyond our convening and our dialogue, in that we felt that we've had to walk alongside a number of smallholder groups in terms of building their own ability to facilitate, to convene, and indeed to reflect, and so be able to pull away. And it's been a very challenging process, because we've had to look at ourselves, we've had to look at power, we've had to look at race, we've had to look at all of the issues that have embedded South African society for so long in the work we do, which means that doing things differently takes much longer, really can be frustrating in terms that you see so little what we want to see in progress, but you've got to stick it out in terms of time and period. So that's a little bit of a reflection on the smallholder stuff.
I would like to go deeper with you around some specific examples, but I'm wondering, you had this video you'd like me to share. Which way would you like to go, with the video or with go deeper in example?
I'm Steve. I mean, I'm happy to go deeper. The video we can always refer to afterwards, in our own time. It's really up to you. The video captures a number of scenarios that we co-created with representation from across the food system, as we wanted to step back and away from just some of the smallholder or the nutrition or the elements of the question, and rather have a much broader view of what was going on in order to galvanize the response. You could have a look at it if you like.
Okay, let's just go over to that for a moment. Just hang on here.
Okay, if you drop down.
Okay.
There. It's a report. Oh, there we go.
It's a report. Keep moving down.
Here we
okay, keep moving down. Okay, this picture here, just keep, okay.